This show is brought to you by SalCal Real Estate Connections. Welcome to the Telescope View. We're here today with Rick and Steve, and believe me, we have a very interesting show today, as we are going to cover we're getting inquiries from our viewers who want to know about Air Force Base incursions, and we also are going to cover an event called the British Roswell. And believe me, the icing on the cake is going to be an event involving a missile test. And boy, let me tell you, Rick, we are in for some real treat tonight with what we're going to learn here.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting. Like you said, we're going to talk about some military base UFO sightings, military base incursions. In particular, these are going to be nuclear missile bases, what we're talking about. And they're going to be about UFOs over military nuclear missile bases, our ICBMs. And according to classified files and the people I've spoken with, and some unclassified files, there's been over 200 of these. And in military terminology, or in the nuclear terminology, these are known as bent spears. Okay, a lot of people have heard about broken arrows, where you lose a nuclear weapon. You know, how do you lose a nuclear weapon? But it happens. These are known as a bent spear. A bent spear is an event concerning a nuclear weapon that is significant. It's not as significant as an event called a pinnacle, that means all hands on deck. You hear it all over the news. The military goes alert. Or a dull sword. A dull sword has to do with an insignificant event with nuclear weapons, if there's such a thing. And then, of course, some people have heard the term fated giant. They think that has to do with missiles. It does not. Fated giant's about nuclear military reactors, and we're not going to be talking about that. So we're going to be talking about bent spear incidences. We're going to talk about 4 in particular that some people have heard about. But at the end, I'm going to tell you something that you don't know about these incidents, or about what the military knows about these incidents. Okay?
Wow, that's a mouthful, I'll tell you.
Yeah,
right
there's
now.
a lot here.
I mean, we're talking serious business here.
Well, whenever we get into nuclear missiles, yeah, I'm going to say fairly serious.
Yeah. I'm with
well,
you know,
like again, nuclear missiles, you don't have to be right on target. Close is good enough. So, yeah, we're going to be talking about that. So.
Now, tell me, what is the first base we're going to talk about tonight,
Well,
Rick?
the first one we're going to talk about is Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. And the interesting thing about that is we're going to go back a little bit in time, because over the years, we're not hearing as much about these events. And there's a reason we're not hearing as much about these events. They've kind of become standard operating procedures for the missileers, as we know. We're going to talk about Minot. 3 events, 66, 1967, and 1968.
Wow.
Okay, and we had events on this particular base where an unidentified object appeared over the base. Okay, guards saw it, the commanding officer saw it. In this case of Minot, it was Captain David Schindel. They watched us. Now, the interesting thing about all this is there are files for this. There were reports written, so you can go and you can find them. You can't see the classified version. But anyway, in the case of Minot, let's just pick out one. 10 Minuteman missiles went offline. They had no control of these missiles. Okay?
Offline mean they could not launch if they wanted to?
No, they could not launch. They could see them there, but they couldn't control them. And this as long as this thing was over the base. Now, it gets a little scarier than that. At one point, the missile went active.
Ooh.
And it was armed. And they didn't do it. And at another point in one of these sightings, one of the missile bay's blast doors opened. These are 2,700-pound doors, 2.5 tons. And we have some photos of nuclear missiles. We have a photo of the Minuteman missile. That was our ICBM. So in Minot, this is one event that happened. And another event, they also had missiles go offline. This was in 67. So in 66, they went offline, and then they went active, and they had no control over them for a number of minutes. All the while, there was an unidentified object over the base.
Now, when you mentioned Minot, that's the name of the base?
That's the name of Minot Air Force Base.
M-I-N-O-T?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, are there silos at those Air Force bases?
We're talking about a silo. That's right.
At the Air Force Base?
Yeah.
Okay.
And we have some photos of silos, but we have a silo, and they're in the ground, and there's these giant doors, 2.5 tons. You can't move them.
Yeah.
They opened. The guards were described as awestruck when they saw this happen. The gates were unlocked, as long as this thing was over the base. Now, the interesting thing with Minot is they were waiting. I mean, the missileers, those are the people who control the missiles, were waiting for NORAD to scramble some jet fighters to come over and check this out. No order came. NORAD did not call a scramble. So after a while, the base commander called a scramble. Got some F-106s up in the air. The minute the F-106s got in the air, these things disappeared. The minute the planes left the area, they were back.
They're back. Wow.
That was one incident. That was Minot Air Force Base. And it happened 3 times. Well, the third time was really interesting because they had the same situation. They were losing control of missiles. At the same time, a B-52 was on its approach to land at the Air Force Base. They vectored the B-52 over to see if they could find the object. It did. It found an elliptical lighted object, and it paced it. It paced the object. It took radar images of the object. The crew saw it, and all these went into reports. Now, there's a report that you can see through Freedom of Information, which says a certain amount of information. They don't hide it. Then there's the classified reports that talk about what this is. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, but this was classified, this particular craft that was in the air was classified as an enigma. It's called an enigma craft. And an enigma craft is an alien craft that is piloted robotically. And we'll talk more a little bit about those as we go forward.
It's like a remote thing or something.
Kind of remote, but you have Enigma and then you have Dragonfly. Dragonfly is completely automated. It flies itself. And we're going to talk more about those in an upcoming show. So that was Minot Air Force Base. That was one incursion that...
Now, Rick, I got to ask you a question. Don't you find it interesting that NORAD did not scramble the jets?
Yes, that was an interesting point. Why wouldn't you scramble a jet?
Why would you not scramble the jets?
Do you already know what the answer is?
Well, that's the scary thing.
Well, like I said once before, I spoke to an Air Force officer one time, and I'm saying, why aren't you guys doing more about this? And then he looked me right in the eye, and he goes, Rick, how much time would you spend looking for the answer, or looking for something that you already know the answer to? Okay, good point. Good point that you have there. So that was one base.
But that was back, like 50 years ago. So were there? How long did it take for people to get the information about that? Now, for folks like you, how long did it take for you to find out about this episode that happened in the 60s?
When Minot happened, there was only locally did the newspaper run a story.
Oh yeah, it was not national.
The rest disappeared.
Okay.
See, if it was a pinnacle event, it'd be everywhere, but it disappeared. But why? Then you have Maelstrom, which was in '68, which was in Montana. Okay, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Salas was in charge. This man made the reports. Okay, 20 missiles went offline. They had no control of the missiles whatsoever. They couldn't even see them. So right away they thought it's their equipment. They started checking their equipment. They started checking the computers, what we had at the time. Nothing wrong. But there was an object over the gate. The guards were watching the object over the gate. Now they were informed not to shoot at the object. Not to do anything. Now these guys are pretty serious, air police. So they had that over it. And then they tracked up to another 7 objects in the area. And once again, no fighters were scrambled until they were scrambled locally. They went up. When they went up, the objects disappeared again and then returned once that they were gone. Again, these were categorized as Enigma. Now you're going to ask me at some point, how do we know? And I'm going to tell you that as we get towards the end. How do we know it's an Enigma? How do we know it's a Dragonfly?
I have to say, how did they fix this? What did they do to fix this?
Well, the interesting thing was at Maelstrom, after this happened, they ripped out all the computers from 4 silos and put all new stuff in there because they figured something was broken. And then they took the stuff back and tested it. Nothing wrong with it.
Nothing wrong. Oh, boy.
But they have all the reports, the sightings, drawings, everything of objects, lighted objects over the base that traveled at as slow as 20 knots, or 20 miles an hour, let's say, to as fast as 3,000 miles an hour.
Wow.
These are official military reports. All right, we're not talking about somebody standing on the street. These exist. For people who don't believe this, go look it up.
No,
you're going to see it.
You're talking a multi-night event in some cases.
In some cases.
Was it the same UFO that they saw? Same type of craft?
Not necessarily. Sometimes they're described as metallic. Now, what we know now is that they're not really metallic. They look metallic, but that's actually a version of the lighting that they have, or they look lighted. That's actually a reaction of the power that they use reacting with our atmosphere. And we're going to talk about that in another show. We're going to talk about how these things work in another show. And we'll talk about how we know. Okay? So that was 2 events, or actually there was 4 there.
Yeah.
And Minot actually had 8. I'm only going to talk about 3 because I'm not going to tell you the other 5 because you already know these, and nobody's ever talked about those.
Okay.
Maelstrom was the second one.
That makes me want to know about the other 5.
Of course it does.
We're not going to talk about it. Go ahead.
But then
offline we will.
Then there was the Mansman missile test in Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. Now this one is really interesting. It's funny a little bit. There's some humor in this one. This was a little earlier. This was 1964. But when we started with these missiles, and this was an Atlas missile, when we started testing these missiles, we test them. And as part of testing, we would film the testing so they could see the missile go up. And
So in reality, it had a dummy warhead.
this one had a dummy warhead,
Okay.
which is correct.
Yep.
So we had a guy out there. He was in charge of filming them, and he took a look. He set up his camera. The missile went up. Him and his crew said, "Great, we got it." And they sat down and did what they did. They probably had a smoke or two.
Yeah.
When it got done, they took the canister, gave it to photographic, they developed it. Next day, he was called into the office of his commanding officer, Major Florence Mansman. Lieutenant Robert Jacobs is the man who did the video. He was called into the office, and when he got in there were 3 men in there sitting in suits. They said nothing to him. And Mansman said nothing to him, didn't greet him, didn't do anything. He said, just have a seat over there. So he had him sit down. They had a camera set up. He goes, oh, great, we're going to watch my work. It's going to be beautiful. Everybody's going to love it. So they started, finally Mansman said, good morning. He said, good morning. He goes, okay. He turned on the camera started running. They're watching. Beautiful shot, missile going up in the air. All of a sudden, a lighted object, a lighted elliptical object comes into frame and circles this missile. The missile's traveling 18,000 miles an hour. Wow. Okay? It's traveling 18,000 miles. Mansman has been interviewed years and years. Right before he died a number of years ago, he goes, I stand by our report. This is what happened. He looks at these guys and he goes, you guys fooling around? What are you doing out there? He thought it was a joke. And they're saying, what? We don't know. So this object's circling this at 18,000 miles an hour.
Yeah, keeping up with it.
Keeping up with it. Orbiting it. At that point, it emits 4 flashes of lights at the cardinal points of the compass. These lights apparently hit the missile. The missile started to tumble and went out of control. And after that, Mansman said, what's going on here? And Jacob said, we don't know. This is what happened. And once again, they believe this was an Enigma craft. It was a craft that was piloted, robotically piloted by somebody, which we probably know today as the Greys.
Did we have, when that thing went tumbling, was there any tape of that?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah, the whole thing.
So we see it tumbling in the tape.
Right, the whole thing. After that, those 3 men took the tape, took everything else, they disappeared. The only thing they didn't take was the report.
Just so people know that the camera that was used here, Steve, was very special.
A very special camera.
It actually came from Patrick Air Force Base in Florida, and they used this thing when the shuttle goes up.
Yep.
I mean, this thing was a special piece of equipment.
Now, for some people who would say, oh, that's impossible, I'm going to draw you to recent events. We have weapons out there, electromagnetic weapons, particle beam weapons. Back a couple of years ago, and we've tested these. Back a couple of years ago when the missiles were falling in Israel, they were coming from the Middle East, Lebanon or wherever. Mm-hmm. They were showing video of this, and all of a sudden the missile would just, poof, break apart. And the newsmen would say, that's because it's not a very well-built missile. Absolutely not. That was one of the weapons that we've been using and developed with Israel that would break these missiles apart. So we can do it today. Is it possible somebody else did it back then? And again, an Enigma craft, meaning it was piloted or robotically piloted, because the Greys are believed to be not an actual living alien, but in fact a biologically created entity made by aliens. Just like we don't want to go someplace, we send them in that place. And that was those 2. Those were missile-based incursions. And of course, the other one you mentioned was Rendlesham Forest and Bentwaters in 1980.
Well, let me tell you, that was the British Roswell.
The British Roswell is what it's called.
It's a special event, and it's hard to understand. I mean, I'm sure you got a few things to say about that.
Well, Larry, it's hard to stop me from saying.
Oh, I know.
He's fun at a party. Yeah, let me tell you.
Bentwaters, Rendlesham Forest is really a very popular. I mean, I think some people out there who are watching this have heard about this. This happened at the Bentwaters, Rendlesham Forest. They're joint bases, RAF bases. But we have control of one of the bases. Actually, it's the 67th Aerospace Recovery and Rescue Wing. What is that? But anyway, they're there. But they also have nuclear weapons there. And over a period of 2 nights, an unidentified lighted object showed up over the base. And the guards saw it. They called into the base commanders. They were watching this thing for hours. On the second night when it came back, the commander said, okay, I want to see this myself. So the deputy base commander of a nuclear base went out to look at this. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt went out to watch this. They followed this thing into the forest, okay? When they got into the forest, he brought a tape recorder with him. and he recorded everything that happened. He was speaking through the recorder. He still has these tapes, and he would say exactly what was happening. And they followed this object out there. It was kind of triangular shaped. It had a dome on it. They followed it. It was a glowing object. They got close enough to touch this object. And the interesting thing is when they touched it, it had a surface that felt like pebbled glass, and it was cool. And that's interesting because pebbled glass, ceramics, is what we used on the bottom of the space shuttle to control heat. And the cooling feature is something that happens with electromagnetic fields. Now, we're working with something now called mercury vapor plasma. We take mercury vapor and we compress it. And supposedly that's what makes some of our secret aircraft fly. And when you compress it like that, it causes a cooling around the craft. So it's interesting that in 1980 they were describing this type of effect. The thing with this is there was a ton of reports. They were given to the Ministry of Defense in England, but we didn't give them everything. There are classified secret reports still held by the United States Air Force. And the people I spoke with, they told me more about this as about what happened here. They characterized this as a dragonfly. There's nobody in this one. This was a probe. This was a
drone?
A drone type of thing.
You're kidding.
But not a drone.
Oh, wow.
Their drones are not like our drones.
When you say there, you mean there?
There.
Okay.
Their drones are alive by our standards.
Yeah.
The very type of thing we're working on. And in a couple of shows, we're going to talk exactly about that. We're going to talk about alien spacecraft, what classified files believe them to be, and how they relate to technology that we're using. But for now, we're going to stick with the Bentwaters case. 5, 6, 7 airmen saw this. Lieutenant Colonel saw this. The general, who was supposed to be in charge, actually passed on the report. Normally, he wouldn't. There's a lot of information about this, but what you're going to find online is the declassified versions. You're not going to see the classified versions.
And from what I've studied on this event, I mean, this thing was going through the woods, kind of steering where it was going. I mean,
it went through the trees.
It went, yeah, it was like dodging the trees and everything else.
Now, outside the forest, there was a lighthouse. And people tried to say they were seeing the light from the lighthouse, but they're standing right next to it. The interesting thing about the lighthouse is when you look at it from the perspective of where these people were, there's a shield around the back of the light, so it wouldn't shine into the forest. It would only shine out.
Okay.
You're looking at the back of it.
Right. So here we have a number of bases where unidentified objects, clearly outside our capability, were sighted by military people who wrote military reports, reported this information. Okay, so it's documented. People whose lives depend on what they can see and what they can analyze. So when you look at that, what's the implication of all this? Why don't we get concerned about this? Why aren't we doing something about this? Or are we?
Seems like it's too passive to me. Well, you know, like, I mean, do we really know why this is going on? Maybe.
And I always wondered if, you hear about these, like even with our own government, the CIA and things, but then you hear about, what is it, the NSA that's above that, or all these other, it seems the higher up you go, the quieter things get. So is there a possibility, just for sake of discussion, that there is the Air Force, but there's something else that we have that's up here that maybe even the Air Force isn't that aware of?
Well, maybe it hypothetically could be something called Flight 9.
What's Flight 9?
Okay, and that's kind of where we're going here. You're absolutely right. The NSA does one thing, and they do a lot of the cyber intelligence type of stuff. We actually worked with them. The CIA are the spy guys. They kind of work together.
Yep.
But above all of this is a level that you get to that's beyond all of this. And the thing is that the general operations within the military don't know anything about this. They pass it on to their intelligence group. This is what they've learned to do. They pass it on to their intelligence group. That intelligence group passes on to another one, and it eventually gets to Flight 9. Okay, Flight 9 is the one who really takes care of all this stuff. They were created because commanders were saying, listen, we're seeing this stuff. Our guys are reporting this stuff. We got to tell them something. We got to do something.
We got to go, yep.
So good soldiers were told, listen, you report it, it's going to be going up, it's going to be taken care of, that's all you need to know. And the pilots were happy with that. The airmen were happy with that. So Flight 9 are the people. Okay, so who's Flight 9? And that's where I wanted to get to towards here. So does anybody want to say who's Flight 9? All right.
Who is Flight 9?
Who is Flight 9? Now, do you know how
And why is it 9 and not Flight 8?
I don't know why it's 9.
Well, there's...
You know why it's 9? I don't know.
No,
why
I
it's 9.
don't. I don't.
If you know how the Air Force, the way they, you have the Army, you have squads and
Yeah,
platoons. The Air Force has airmen, flights, squadrons, and that type of thing. So they're just called a flight because it's a smaller group of people. Well, actually, not that small. A flight can be kind of large, but they call it a flight. That's just an organization. Classified reports indicate that since late 1947, that we've had a group referred to as Flight 9 who has had limited communication with an intelligent alien race. Limited communication. So it's not what you see on TV. Hey, what are you doing today? Limited communication, which is based on their interest, not ours. Okay? And based on this communication, the ETs acknowledge these events that are happening.
Extraterrestrials.
Yep. They acknowledge these events, but they give no explanation for them.
No.
Now it's interesting that these events are not considered hostile by our military. They broke out. They broke one of our missiles.
They're allowing them to happen.
And in doing this, they classify that craft. So now they know, Flight 9 will classify them so they know what we're dealing with. So we have Dragonfly, Enigma, or Cadillac. Cadillac, okay? A Dragonfly is what we would consider a probe, is what was in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Okay. All those things that came down, they said we monitor no biologics.
Yeah.
It's a probe. We do the same thing on Mars, we do the same thing on Saturn, and okay. Yeah. Enigma is you know what Enigma is? It's a riddle wrapped inside. Okay. Enigma is piloted, but they believe it's piloted by what they call a biologically engineered entity. These guys. This is what they believe. These are according to classified reports based on what these men were telling me. Now, Cadillac, that is the gold standard right there. Now, what do you think a Cadillac is? Cadillac is the real thing. The Cadillac is what they would consider the real alien. Would arrive or would be occupying a Cadillac. Cadillacs are incredibly rare. No matter what anybody believes and all the stories you hear, of course, this is all hard to believe. I understand that, all right? But let's say within this realm, for the time being, we believe all this. A Cadillac is incredibly rare. Nobody jumps into something and says, oh, I'm going to go visit Earth today. It's state-sponsored. It's got to be coordinated, just like we coordinate things. So for an alien life form actually to come here is incredibly rare. So Cadillacs are very rare. Yep.
So when we have a crash where there's an actual ET, it's very, very rare, right?
Yeah. Well, where we have an ET, it's probably not going to be. We haven't had any with an ET.
Yeah.
We've had them with the Greys.
So as far as we know.
Well, as far as we know, there could be. I mean, like these guys that I spoke to, they knew a lot. But like they said, for everything we know, they said if we know this much, there's this much.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, when you think about those events at the Air Force Base with silos to I mean, we're talking nuclear warheads here. This is not just a regular event, you know.
Now, the belief is that the similar things happen around the world, that the Soviets had the same issues. So they kind of know what we're dealing with, that they have some of the same information. That's the belief at this point.
And it's all unexplained. That's what bothers me the most.
Well, what I like about all these is there are official reports as unexplained, and they're military reports by military people, high-ranking military people. Lieutenant Charles Hall, spoke in front of the National Press Corps.
I mean, you're talking very educated people and that are high up in rank, too.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, they're not afraid to admit it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as usual, Rick, you are just the man to talk to when it comes to these ETs and UFOs.
I'm the man.
And as usual, buddy, our time is flying here. And we're going to have to call it a day for today's show.
I hope to see this show myself. I can't wait to watch it.
Let me tell you, I can't wait to do our next show.
Yeah, I want to see what I said.
You know, and boy, it's so interesting. All these events are just special. And I want to tell you, first of all, go to our email us at theviewshow@aol.com. Let us know what you're thinking and what you'd like to see. And if you don't believe what we're saying here, you could go to websites on your computers that'll verify most of this information or give you more about it. Thank you for watching the show.
Good night.